A street performer thought he could upstage a royal guard, using tricks and theatrics to steal the spotlight. But when he tried to trip the soldier, the real show began, and the only act left was his own humiliation. Here's what happened. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow, at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the royal guards that you won't want to miss. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as Jacques Mirage adjusted his weathered top hat with practiced flair. His fingers, calloused from years of sleight-of-hand tricks, moved restlessly through his deck of cards while his eyes fixed on the steady stream of tourists. All of them walking past his carefully arranged performance space, their attention drawn instead to the stoic figure in scarlet standing at attention nearby. Jacques had spent the last decade building his reputation as London's premier street magician. His shows usually drew crowds within minutes, his natural charm and quick wit earning him both applause and generous tips. But here, in the shadow of Buckingham Palace, he found himself playing second fiddle to a man whose entire act consisted of standing perfectly still. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a seasoned performer. "Step right up and witness true magic." A few tourists glanced his way, but their cameras remained pointed at the royal guard, his ceremonial uniform and bearskin cap proving more captivating than Jacques' elaborate card flourishes. Frustration crept into Jacques' movements as he watched another family hurry past his velvet-lined performance table. His tricks had earned him standing ovations in Covent Garden. His illusions had stopped traffic in Piccadilly Circus. But here, he couldn't even hold an audience's attention for 30 seconds. "Perhaps," he muttered, sliding a coin across his knuckles with fluid grace, "they need a more dramatic demonstration." His eyes narrowed as he studied the guard's unwavering stance. 8 years of performing on London's streets had taught Jacques one crucial lesson. Attention was currency, and he'd never accepted being shortchanged. A group of school children gathered near the guard, their excited whispers and pointing fingers making Jacques' jaw clench. His latest trick, a complex manipulation that had taken months to perfect, went completely unnoticed as tourists continued streaming past, their backs turned to his performance space. "Unbelievable," he scoffed, watching an elderly couple pose for photos with the guard. "They're all mesmerized by someone doing absolutely nothing." His fingers closed around his deck of cards, knuckles whitening slightly. Years of honing his craft, countless hours perfecting each movement, and here he was, upstaged by a living statue. The morning wore on, and Jacques' demonstrations became increasingly flamboyant. Cards cascaded through the air. Coins appeared and vanished. Silk scarves danced between his fingers, all met with indifference from the passing crowds. Meanwhile, the guard remained motionless, commanding attention without lifting a finger. Something dark flickered in Jacques' eyes as he watched yet another tour group cluster around the guard. His hand dipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against the tools of his trade. If they wanted a show, he thought, then perhaps it was time to give them one they wouldn't forget. Jacques' movements became more deliberate as he edged his performance space closer to the guard's position. Each trick, each flourish, now seemed aimed less at entertaining and more at provoking a reaction. His usual patter took on a sharper edge, barbed comments slipping between card manipulations. "Notice, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying an undercurrent of challenge, "how a true performer brings life to his art." His hands wove intricate patterns in the air, cards dancing between his fingers. Unlike some who think standing still qualifies as entertainment. Among the passing tourists, an older man paused, his bearing suggesting military background. He watched Jacques' increasingly aggressive routine with growing concern, recognizing the telltale signs of someone about to cross a line. The veteran's hand unconsciously touched the service pin on his lapel, years of experience telling him to stay alert. Jax's performance space had now encroached well within the guard's designated area. His movements grew more expansive, each gesture deliberately invading the ceremonial boundary. Cards seemed to materialize inches from the guard's face, only to vanish in elaborate flourishes that brought Jax uncomfortably close to the soldier's position. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he called out to the gathering crowd. "How some people mistake rigidity for dignity." A cascade of coins clattered against the pavement, rolling deliberately toward the guard's polished boots. While true artistry requires something more dynamic. The guard maintained his disciplined stance, but there was a subtle tension in his bearing now, visible only to those who knew what to look for. His eyes, though fixed forward, held the sharp awareness of a soldier assessing a potential threat. The morning sun caught his medals, each one testament to the kind of discipline Jax was deliberately mocking. "You know what the difference is between us?" Jax continued, his showman's smile never reaching his eyes. "I have earned every moment of attention through skill and dedication." He punctuated each word with a card trick that brought him closer to the guard, while others just stand there, hiding behind tradition and fancy uniforms. The veteran had moved closer now, his weathered face set in lines of disapproval. He recognized something in Jax's movements, the calculated precision of someone building toward confrontation. A young family nearby sensed the shifting atmosphere, the parents quietly guiding their children back from what was beginning to feel less like a performance and more like a powder keg. Jax's routine had abandoned any pretense of entertainment. His tricks became increasingly aggressive, scarves whipping through the air near the guard's face, coins bouncing closer to his feet, cards fluttering against his uniform. Each move was a deliberate challenge, testing the boundaries of the guard's famous restraint. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jax announced, his voice taking on a theatrical edge that barely masked its underlying hostility, "you're about to witness something special. A demonstration of true performance art." His hands moved with practiced precision, but there was nothing playful in their motion now. Every gesture seemed calculated to provoke, to push limits, to force a reaction. The guard's shadow stretched across Jax's performance space, a line in the sand that was about to be crossed. The morning had grown warmer, but several onlookers shivered, sensing the growing tension. The veteran took another step forward, recognizing the signs of imminent confrontation from countless similar situations. "You see," Jax continued, his movements becoming more erratic, more challenging, "a real performer knows how to command attention." His eyes locked onto the guard's impassive face with almost predatory focus. And sometimes that requires changing the rules of engagement. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Jax positioned himself directly in the guard's patrol path. His hands never stopped moving, cards and coins flowing between his fingers like water, but there was nothing magical about their intent now. "Watch closely," Jax called out, deliberately positioning his props across the guard's patrol route, "because true magic isn't about standing still, it's about making others move to your rhythm." His voice carried the dangerous edge of someone who'd decided respect was a weakness he could exploit. The guard's patrol time was approaching. Everyone familiar with palace routine knew these moments demanded absolute clarity of path, but Jax had arranged his performance space like a maze of obstacles. Cards scattered strategically, coins placed at measured intervals, his table positioned just where the guard would need to turn. "You see," Jax continued, his showman's patter now dripping with barely concealed malice, "some people mistake silence for strength." He moved with calculated precision, each step bringing him closer to the guard's path. "But what happens when tradition meets talent? When ceremony faces real skill?" The veteran who'd been watching stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Son, you're interfering with official duties. I suggest you reconsider your position." His words were measured, a warning born from understanding the consequences that were about to unfold. But Jax merely laughed, the sound sharp and challenging. "Official duties? Is that what we're calling this charade?" His hands never stopped moving, props appearing and vanishing as he spoke. "Let's see how official it feels when someone doesn't play by their rules." A young mother pulled her children back, recognizing the shift from entertainment to antagonism. "Come along, loves," she whispered, but couldn't quite bring herself to leave. Like everyone else in the growing crowd, she sensed she was about to witness something significant. The guard's patrol time arrived, and with mechanical precision, he began his measured march. Each step was perfectly placed, each movement honed by centuries of tradition. But now, those steps would lead him directly through Jax's carefully arranged chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jax announced, his voice rising with theatrical flair, "observe how our stoic friend handles a real performance challenge." He moved like a conductor orchestrating chaos, his props creating an increasingly complex obstacle course. The veteran's voice cut through again, sharper now. "This isn't entertainment, boy. This is interference with a serving soldier." But Jax was beyond hearing warnings. His focus had narrowed to this moment, this confrontation he'd carefully crafted. "A serving soldier," Jax scoffed, positioning himself mere inches from the guard's patrol route. "Serving what? Tourism? Photography? Let's see how well that famous discipline serves when someone doesn't bow to your choreographed routine." The guard approached with unwavering focus, each step precise, despite the hazards Jax had laid. His bearing spoke of years of service, not just ceremonial, but real military experience that Jax was too blind with arrogance to recognize. "Notice, everyone," Jax called out, moving closer still, "how our friend here thinks his painted-on discipline makes him untouchable." His hands worked faster now, cards and coins creating a glittering distraction. But what happens when someone disrupts the script? The veteran had moved closer to the young family, his posture tense with anticipation. He'd seen that look before, in alleyways in Belfast, in marketplaces in Basra. The look of someone about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. The guard's patrol brought him within feet of Jax's position. The morning sun caught his medals, each one telling stories of service Jax couldn't begin to comprehend. His boots moved with measured precision, navigating the strewn obstacles with practiced ease. "Impressive," Jax sneered, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. "But let's add a variable to your equation of excellence." His foot shifted slightly, deliberately extending into the guard's path. The movement was subtle, practiced. The same precision he used in his sleight of hand now turned to a darker purpose. The air seemed to freeze as the guard approached the final steps. Jax's smile had transformed into something cold and calculating, his performer's charm stripped away to reveal the petty jealousy beneath. His foot adjusted one final time, positioned with the same care he usually reserved for his most intricate illusions. "After all," he announced to the tensely watching crowd, "every great performance needs a moment of unexpected drama." The last word hung in the air like a challenge, as the guard's next step brought him directly into Jax's trap. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation, each movement carrying the weight of years of combat training. As the guard's boot approached, Jax's foot moved with what he thought was perfect timing. A magician's flourish turned to sabotage, his ankle angled just so, ready to catch the guard's stride in a moment of calculated disruption. The morning sun caught his polished shoe, already positioned to deliver his grand performance of humiliation. But Jax had made a crucial miscalculation. Those who thought the Queen's Guard were merely ceremonial soldiers had never witnessed them in action. Years of combat experience in the world's most dangerous corners had taught the guard to read body language like a sixth sense, to anticipate threats before they materialized, to respond with a precision that spoke of battlefields rather than palace grounds. In that split second, as Jax's foot extended for its intended trip, the guard's training took over. To the casual observer, nothing seemed to change in his measured stride. But there was a subtle shift in his bearing, a barely perceptible adjustment in his stance that spoke volumes to those who knew what to watch for. The ceremonial march transformed into something else entirely, a combat maneuver disguised as ceremony. The guard's boot, polished to mirror shine that morning with the same dedication he'd once applied to combat gear, came down with deliberate force. It found Jax's extended foot not as an obstacle, but as a target, pinning it to the ground with the kind of precision that had once secured positions under heavy fire. The movement was so smooth, so controlled, that most tourists probably missed it entirely, their cameras still clicking away at what seemed like a normal patrol. But Jax felt it. Oh, did he feel it? The full weight of military discipline pressed down on his trapped foot, not with crushing force, but with the calculated pressure of someone who knew exactly how much weight to apply. It was the kind of control that came from years of knowing the difference between subduing a threat and causing unnecessary harm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jax started, his showman's voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. His throat suddenly felt dry, the words sticking like the cards that now trembled in his usually steady hands. "It seems we've reached a rather unexpected—" The rest of his sentence evaporated as he tried to pull his foot free, only to discover that each subtle movement was met with an equally subtle increase in pressure. It was like being caught in a vice that responded to resistance with measured authority. The guard's eyes remained forward, his posture a textbook example of ceremonial precision, but there was nothing ceremonial about the pressure holding Jax in place. Each of the street performers' attempts to wiggle free was met with a minute adjustment of weight, a silent conversation between captor and captured, spoken in a language of pressure points and controlled force. The guard's training had taught him that sometimes the most powerful messages required no words at all. "I believe," the veteran spoke up from the crowd, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had been on both ends of similar situations, "you've performed yourself into a rather precarious position, son." His words carried the weight of experience, of nights spent in combat zones where reading body language meant the difference between life and death. Jax's face had transformed. Gone was the confident smirk of a street performer commanding his stage. In its place was a grimace of discomfort and dawning realization, the look of someone suddenly understanding that he'd stepped into a depth he hadn't known existed. His hands, usually so fluid in their movements, had lost their grace. The cards he'd been manipulating scattered across the pavement like autumn leaves, each one a piece of his carefully crafted image falling away. "Look," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, meant only for the guard's ears, all pretense of showmanship abandoned. "I was just trying to add some entertainment to your routine, a bit of fun for the crowd." But the pressure on his foot remained steady, immovable as the principles it protected. Each word of explanation seemed to echo hollowly in the space between them, bouncing off the guard's unwavering discipline like rain off stone. The young mother who'd watched everything unfold found herself turning this moment into a lesson for her children. "You see, loves," she whispered, though her words carried clearly in the hushed courtyard, "that's what happens when you mistake discipline for weakness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the strongest." Her impromptu wisdom spread through the watching crowd, adding another layer to Jax's mounting humiliation as he stood there, trapped not just by physical pressure, but by the weight of his own misjudgment. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, not from physical strain, but from the psychological weight of his position. Every second the guard held him there stripped away another layer of his carefully constructed superiority. His attempts to appear in control became increasingly desperate, each movement making his predicament more apparent to the watching crowd. Perhaps, the veteran suggested, moving closer, it's time to acknowledge that some performances require respect rather than disruption. His eyes met Jax's with the kind of understanding that made the magician look away first. The guard maintained his position with the same precision he applied to every aspect of his duty. Each passing moment demonstrated the difference between Jax's superficial showmanship and the guard's deep-rooted discipline. The morning sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to the street performer's growing discomfort and diminishing pride. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to Jax, but was precisely measured in the guard's mental count, the pressure released. The guard's next step came with perfect timing, leaving Jax with nothing but a sore foot and a very public lesson in respect. The cards lay scattered around his feet, his props disarrayed, his performance space in chaos. But the guard's patrol continued with unwavering precision, every step carrying the weight of tradition. Right then, Jax attempted to recover, reaching for his scattered props. As I was saying about real performance. But his words died in his throat as the guard completed his patrol circuit and turned to face him directly. There was nothing ceremonial in that movement. It carried the weight of combat experience, of battles fought far from these peaceful grounds. "Mr. Mirage," the guard's voice cut through the air like a steel blade, quiet yet commanding absolute attention. "Since you're so interested in performance, allow me to demonstrate the difference between showmanship and service." The guard's bearing had transformed, though his posture remained perfect. Gone was the ceremonial statue Jax had mocked. In its place stood a warrior whose presence filled the courtyard with undeniable authority. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight, each one telling stories of service that made Jax's card tricks seem suddenly childish. "This uniform," the guard continued, his eyes fixing Jax with the kind of stare that had faced down real threats in far more dangerous places, "is not a costume. These medals were not earned by standing still. While you perfect your illusions, we perfect the skills that keep people safe." The veteran moved to stand beside the guard, his own service pins glinting. "3 tours in Afghanistan," he added, his voice carrying the same quiet authority. 2 in Iraq. The man you just tried to humiliate has probably seen more real performance under fire than you'll witness in a lifetime of street shows. Jax's hands, usually so confident in their movements, fumbled with his fallen cards. Each one seemed to slip through his fingers, his technical mastery deserting him under the weight of genuine authority. The young family watched from nearby, the children learning a lesson no street performance could teach. "You speak of earning attention," the guard continued, his voice level but carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "Let me explain what that truly means. Every movement, every step, every moment at attention. They're not for show. They represent centuries of sacrifice, discipline, and unwavering dedication to duty." Jax found himself stepping backward, his performer's confidence crumbling beneath the guard's steady gaze. His foot brushed against his velvet-lined table, nearly toppling his carefully arranged props. The morning sun seemed to fade behind clouds, as if nature itself was acknowledging the gravity of the moment. "I've watched you all morning," the guard added, his tone carrying no anger, only firm purpose. "Seeking attention through increasingly desperate means. But true respect, Mr. Mirage, isn't commanded through tricks and disruption. It's earned through service, sacrifice, and the kind of discipline you tried to undermine." The veteran nodded slowly, then addressed the gathered crowd. "This uniform represents something deeper than ceremony. Each button, each medal, each precise movement carries the weight of history, of men and women who've given everything to protect what these grounds represent." Jax's throat had gone dry, his usual quick wit failing him. The guard's presence seemed to fill the entire courtyard, making the magician's earlier bravado feel hollow and small. His attempts to gather his scattered props became increasingly clumsy, his hands shaking slightly under the combined weight of the guard's authority and his own shame. "So the next time you consider turning duty into your personal stage," the guard concluded, his voice carrying the unmistakable command of someone who had earned every inch of his authority, "remember this moment. Remember that behind every ceremonial stance there stands a soldier who's proven their worth in places far removed from tourist attractions and street performances." With perfect precision, the guard resumed his post, but now the watching crowd saw him differently. Not as a tourist attraction or a ceremonial fixture, but as a living symbol of principles that Jax's petty disruption had only served to highlight. The veteran's final words carried across the courtyard as Jax hurriedly gathered his belongings. "Some performances, son, require no audience. They're measured in duty, dignity, and the kind of strength that stands firm without needing applause." "You see, Mr. Mirage," the veteran spoke again, his voice carrying decades of understanding, "what you mistook for simple ceremony is actually the visible edge of something far deeper. Each movement, each stance represents countless hours of training, years of service, and the kind of dedication that can't be mastered through sleight of hand." Jax stood amidst his scattered props, the lessons sinking in with each passing moment. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing understanding of the gulf between his superficial performances and the guard's genuine service. The cards in his hands, once tools of his trade, now felt like nothing more than painted paper. "This uniform," the veteran continued, gesturing to the guard's immaculate presentation, "carries the weight of tradition not because of how it looks, but because of what it represents. Every crease, every button, every medal tells a story of sacrifice and service. Stories earned in places where illusions offer no protection and tricks win no applause." Jax's gaze kept returning to the guard's medals, each one now a stark reminder of the difference between earning attention and demanding it. His own costume, the top hat, the tailored vest, the practiced flourishes, suddenly seemed garish and hollow in comparison. "The discipline you mocked," the veteran added, his tone carrying no judgment, only wisdom, "isn't about standing still. It's about standing ready, ready to serve, ready to protect, ready to uphold the principles that allow others the freedom to perform their art in peace." The morning had grown warmer, but Jax felt a different kind of heat, the burning recognition of his own misguided arrogance. Each attempt to regain his performer's composure only served to highlight how thoroughly the guard's silent dignity had outmatched his theatrical displays. "Perhaps," the veteran suggested, watching Jax struggle with his belongings, "the greatest performance today wasn't about magic tricks or clever distractions. It was about demonstrating the kind of strength that needs no audience to validate its worth." The guard maintained his watch, his bearing now carrying an added dimension of authority that needed no explanation. Each tourist who passed now saw beyond the ceremonial uniform to the soldier beneath, someone who had earned their position through more than just the ability to stand still. As Jax finally gathered the last of his props, the veteran offered one final observation. "True magic, son, isn't in making things appear or disappear. It's in standing firm for something meaningful, in maintaining dignity under pressure, in serving a purpose greater than personal glory." The lesson hung in the air like an invisible barrier between Jax's world of illusions and the guard's reality of service. Each step he took away from his failed performance felt heavy with understanding, his earlier bravado replaced by the kind of humility that only comes from confronting one's own misconceptions. Behind him, the guard continued his duty, his presence now a powerful reminder that some things can't be diminished by tricks or mockery. They can only be strengthened by those who try to challenge their worth. That afternoon left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. While Jacques Mirage quietly collected his remaining props and disappeared into the London crowds, the Royal Guard maintained his watch with unwavering dedication. His presence now carried an added dimension of authority that resonated with each passing tourist. What thoughts race through your mind when you witness true dignity standing firm against disrespect? How often do we mistake silence for weakness, only to discover that real strength lies in disciplined restraint? If this story taught us anything about the Royal Guards, it's that behind their ceremonial stance lies a depth of character and service that no theatrical performance could ever match. Their dignity isn't a show put on for tourists. It's a reflection of the values they've sworn to protect. Before you leave, take a moment to consider when you've encountered similar displays of quiet strength in your own life. How has your perspective on respect and tradition changed after witnessing this encounter? Did this story resonate with you? Help us spread these important messages about respect, dignity, and service by hitting that like button below. Your support allows us to continue sharing these powerful stories with viewers around the world. Subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories about the Royal Guards and the values they represent. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to ensure you never miss our latest uploads. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the difference between showmanship and true service. Let's work together to promote respect for those who stand guard over our traditions and values. Looking for more stories about dignity and respect? Check out our previous videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one offers unique insights into the unwavering dedication of these remarkable servicemen and women. Remember, true strength isn't always found in movement or words. Sometimes it stands calm, steadfast, and ready to teach those willing to learn. Until our next story, stay respectful, stay mindful, and never underestimate those who serve with quiet dignity.